Welcome back to Lettermen Row, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Spencer Holbrook, and on the other side of my screen, the other side of the rivalry, Anthony Broom from the Wolverine.com on threes. Fantastic Michigan site. Anthony, thanks for joining the show, man.
Of course, happy to be here. Thanks for thinking of me.
So it's been an eventful offseason at Michigan. Jim Harbaugh, a few assistants, to name just the least. A lot of guys in the NFL. It was almost like the Rich Eisen show, watching the late rounds of the NFL draft as the Michigan guys on day 2 and 3 just kept flying off the board, and obviously McCarthy in the first round. What did the spring look like for Michigan? Was it a transition period? Did it feel like that? And how did it go? Sharon Moore's first time kind of running the thing full time.
I think it was fairly smooth. You put a bit of an asterisk next to that in terms of all the change that happened. I mean, this was, don't get me wrong, Sharon Moore was qualified for the job, the right guy for the job. You had Jim Harbaugh's successor in-house, which was good. And I think with that, a lot of people assumed, and maybe even myself included a little bit, that it would be kind of just a smooth transition into this next era. But this was a coaching change where you flip the entire defensive side of the ball. There's a couple positions on offense that shift around. Obviously, when Sharon moves up, you move up Kurt Campbell to offensive coordinator. So, a lot of change, especially on offense. I mean, pretty much their entire starting offense, sans Colston Loveland, is in the NFL now, or was taken in the draft or signed as an undrafted free agent. So there's a lot of change there. And, defensively, I think despite the talent they lose, I think it's a mostly known commodity. Crazy to think maybe even top heavier than last year's group. You have some depth questions there, but the fact that they bring in a Wink Martindale to run a defense that a defensive scheme that he basically, he's the self-proclaimed OG of. So a lot of the terminology is the same. Some of it's different. A few of the tenets of it are different. Probably going to see a little more man coverage. Going to see probably pressures come from a few different types of areas. But, I think Joel Klatt put it best during the spring game, where I'm paraphrasing here, was basically everything is the same, but everything is also different, where a lot of what's going on right now feels like a continuation of what preceded it, but also there are obviously going to be some new wrinkles there. And, anytime that you break in an entire new staff on that side of the ball, there are going to be question marks about it. So I think for me, you see how the totality of that comes together. You see how the spring game plays out. Again, that was really our only public view of how spring ball was going, because Michigan doesn't open its practices to the public. I think I walked out of the spring feeling a little more comfortable about the talent on the team, maybe some of the depth as well. But, the biggest questions with this team are that quarterback position. It's at wide receiver. It's, you're flipping all 5 starters on the offensive line. So a lot of question marks there still, and many of them can't be answered until Michigan gets into the regular season. But I think all in all, for the most part, with a few bumps here and there, it was a pretty productive offseason and somewhat of a smooth transition.
I'll make this one pretty simple for you. Who's playing quarterback up north now?
Man, Alex Orji is going to play a lot. I don't know if that's in a platoon role. I don't know if he's the straight up starter. I think when you saw what he did in the spring game, you could see the vision of what he can be, right? It's going to be more of, the quarterback runs will be a little more featured in the offense, maybe some options, some play action stuff. And when it's on time, he's got some good arm talent. But the fact is, he's still extremely raw. The footwork, the mechanics just aren't quite what they need to be yet. And there's going to be a lot of time spent in the lab over the next several months. So, I mean, if you had to ask me right now who starts the opener, I think it's Alex Orji. Davis Warren is also in that mix, a former walk-on who earned a scholarship a couple of years ago. And Jack Tuttle, who is a 7th-year guy, started his career at Utah, transfers to Indiana, then last season transfers to Michigan. Didn't participate a ton this spring. I believe he was dealing with a shoulder injury, but they say he's going to be in the mix as well. So really there were 5 guys, with Jaden Davis, the true freshman, Jaden Denegal thrown in there. But really right now I see it as a 3-man race, probably more of a 2-man race when it all is said and done. So I see it's either going to be some type of platoon, or they're going to do this Alex Orji thing and see how it goes. So that's where we're at right now.
Yes, Ohio State fans, that is the same Jack Tuttle that Ryan Day went to visit and ended up discovering Chris Olave. Yes, he is still playing college football. Ohio State fans know that story a little too well at this point. And now, who knows? Maybe Jack Tuttle is going to be playing against Ohio State in a weird full circle moment for Ryan Day. You might have to look out there and see Jack Tuttle playing quarterback. How's the offensive line turnover going? You said they're replacing all 5 starters. That was an incredible unit. Really, the last 3 years has just mowed people down. And now it seems like there's more turnover there than there has been in any of those 3 years. What are you expecting from that offensive line? And then really just the offense as a whole, because I look at the depth chart and I try to keep up with Michigan as much as possible. Obviously, Ohio State fans do. There's just by numbers, not a lot of wide receivers on the roster. There's new running backs on the roster. There, obviously, Colston Loveland is that steady rock, like you mentioned. But the offensive line, the receivers, the running backs, there's a lot of new faces there. How is all of that transition going? With new offensive leadership as well. Now that Sharon Moore moved up.
Yeah, offensive line of those groups that you named, I think they're most comfortable with. Now, the fact that you've had there's going to be a bit of a drop off because this is a group that had those stalwarts like Zach Sinter, Trevor Keegan. They won the Joe Moore Award 2 years in a row. They didn't win it last year, but played their best football when it counted. Those last 3 or so games of the year. I think one of the benefits of that is you get to season a few more guys behind the scenes, maybe a little bit more than they may have expected to. A guy like Giovanni El Hadi at guard started games for them a couple of years ago and would have been a starter for them last year. But Zach Sinter runs it back for a senior season. Trevor Keegan runs it back for a 5th season. He's going to be in that starting 5. Josh Preeb comes from Northwestern. He's going to be one of the starters at guard. Greg Crippen at center is a guy that Michigan's liked his development behind the scenes, but had Olu Oluwatimi 2 years ago out of the transfer portal, brought in Drake Nugent 2 years ago from the transfer portal. And it seems like they think he's finally ready to go give this thing a go. And to me, the question marks are at tackle at the moment. Miles Hinton started games for them last year as a Stanford transfer, but it just never really clicked with him. I think the key with him is obviously, he's like 6'7", 340. You want to get a guy that size to play the way that he looks, and it hasn't quite come together for him yet. And to be frank with you, it's his 5th year in college. I don't know if it does come together. Andrew Gentry is a guy that came off of a Mormon mission, needed about a year or so to really get physically developed for the job. I think he probably slides in at one of those tackle spots. I will say this. I think, Grant Newsome moves out. He's kind of been Sharon Moore's right-hand man. He slides into the offensive line coach role, and they're probably going to add a piece for depth out of the portal here sometime this summer. But I think they're pretty content with what they have there. I think that those guys, it's obvious about finding your best 5 and that chemistry that goes together. But yeah, when you lose that many snaps off your offensive line, it's going to be a question mark. At wide receiver, I think their top 3 actually has a chance to be solid to pretty good in Tyler Morris, Frederick Moore, Samaj Morgan. Again, you have you lose guys like Cornelius Johnson or Roman Wilson, who really were 3-year starters for them, and both guys in the NFL after getting selected in the draft. I think that Morris probably slides into that Ronnie Bell / Roman Wilson type of role. Frederick Moore is a guy that they liked as played a little bit as a true freshman last year. I think he's had a good offseason, probably slides into the Cornelius Johnson role. And, really it's just a matter of depth for them. All spring they played with 5 scholarship wide receivers, which, again, you might like, if you're a Michigan fan, you might like what the top 3 looks like, but you're just a pulled hammy or a rolled ankle away from kind of being in some dire straits. And so they added some guys from the portal. CJ Charleston was a guy at Youngstown State that I think will bring some veteran leadership. Amorian Walker, who actually was a wide receiver turned cornerback that played his first 2 years at Michigan, transfers to Ole Miss this winter and then transfers back to Michigan, presumably for a crack at wide receiver. And I wouldn't be surprised if they added someone else there too. So with that group, I think it's more a matter of depth. And then running back, I think what you're going to see is, Donovan Edwards finally sort of emerge into that number 1 back role. You got to play behind Blake Corum. You're not going to take that guy off the field. No one else is going to get a lead back's worth of snaps when you have Blake Corum on your roster. So Edwards is going to get a crack at that. I think you probably see more of a 1A, 1B type of backfield where Kalel Mullings is a guy who maybe is more of that Hassan Haskins type of guy, more of a power runner, more of a between the tackles type of guy. And then they have the best running back in the state of Ohio coming in this summer in Jordan Marshall, which was a big get for Michigan on the recruiting trail. And I think he's going to play right away. So again, you talk about all these guys and all this production that you lose from a group that's played a lot of football for the last few years and put up big numbers. I feel like at running back, they're pretty well built to backfill that. Offensive line, I know they're comfortable with it. And wide receiver and quarterback, to me, are the two biggest questions right now on this team.
Where I don't think there are many questions, and correct me if I'm wrong, is on that defense, because we look at the Ohio State defense and think, oh my gosh, they're bringing everything back. This unit will be one of the best in the country. And I think you could say the exact same thing, just put it in maize and blue tint and say the exact same thing about Michigan, because the defensive tackles are back. You've got Josiah Stewart and a couple other guys at the defensive end that are back. You've got linebackers who are back with a lot of experience. Will Johnson returns, and the fight between Will Johnson and Denzel Burke between Ohio State and Michigan fans may be more interesting than the fight that's been going on for 3 years between Ryan Day and Jim Harbaugh, because they love chirping about these cornerbacks. The safeties look like they're pretty set. This Michigan defense, and really both defenses in this rivalry, look like they're going to be incredible this year. What are the expectations? What are realistic expectations for the Michigan defense this year? Because I think like best defense in the country, 1A, 1B, 1C with Ohio State, Michigan, and maybe Penn State. Like what are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, you might have a question on it coming up soon, but I mean, when I look at this Michigan-Ohio State game coming up this year, I think it's probably going to be more of a rock fight than these last couple of years have been because of how good those defenses are. I mean, I really don't have many questions on the defensive side of the ball, except for, the matter of depth, which is something that, Jim Harbaugh and Jesse Minter last year made it a point to cultivate a lot of that depth early on because the schedule allowed for that. Now you have Texas in week 2 this year. You have Fresno State in week 1, who has won, has been a pretty good program. So there's not going to be that leeway to kind of build and cultivate the depth like there has been over the last few years. But when you look at, just that front alone, and Mason Graham, everywhere you go, you see him mocked as a top 5, top 10 prospect for next year. Kenneth Grant is kind of right on the edge of that first round consideration. I think both of those pass rushers, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, probably NFL guys. I think both your linebackers at Michigan are probably NFL guys with Ernest Hausman and Jayshawn Barham, who transfers in from Maryland. Will Johnson, probably the best of any of them. Another guy that's going to be a top 5, top 10 selection, at least, based on what the mocks say early on. He's got the length, he's got the ball skills. The biggest question for me right now with that defense would be the cornerback depth. Last year in the summer, you go to the transfer portal, you bring in Josh Wallace, who played really solid football as a number 2. And then when called into action, people forget, Will Johnson was hurt during that Ohio State game last year. So he steps up and he has to guard, the Emeka Ibukas, Marvin Harrison Jr.'s. And I thought he performed fairly well and had forced a fumble in the Rose Bowl. And now he's off to the NFL. So they like Jair Hill, who's a true sophomore. DJ Waller was a guy that was projected to compete for that job, but right after spring ball, dips back into the portal, heads to Kentucky. So I think there's a spot to add a corner there, and I think Michigan will add one at some point. They were in on Terrence Brooks from Texas, but he goes to Illinois. Safety, the biggest loss for them is Rod Moore, who tore his ACL during spring ball, and he's an Ohio kid. He had the interception that sealed last year's game for Michigan. That's a big loss for them. But you've got a 5th-year safety in Makari Page and a 6th-year safety in Quentin Johnson, who at least bring experience, and you feel like can at least stabilize things there. Wouldn't be surprised to see them add another safety out of the portal. They like Zeke Berry, but he's more of a nickel and probably fills in for that Mike Sainristil role. So, to me, it's less of a question of the talent on defense. I think it's as good, maybe better when you look at what some of these prospect boards look like, but it's the depth, and it's kind of like the presence and the leadership of it too. Mike Sainristil, every time they needed a play last year, he came up big no matter when it was needed. And I don't know that you can teach that. It's just kind of inherent. So I don't know who that is, in that secondary right now, but when you have that much talent and then system is basically staying the same, and then you bring in a defensive coordinator who, whether you are a fan of, no matter what your takeaways are with how things ended in Baltimore or how things went with the New York Giants, Wink Martindale just spent the last 20 years as an NFL assistant, and much of that as a coordinator. So it's tough to say there's no drop off there. It's going to look different, but again, I just another year in the lab with some of those guys, especially those guys up front. This defense might have to win them games a little more than last year's did. But man, oh man, they are terrific, and it's going to be a lot of fun to watch.
So this is a two-part question, but it's my last question for you, and I'll get you out of here as we kind of preview the opponents here for Ohio State, the biggest opponents, starting with none other than the biggest one, Michigan. All right, let me ask, how do Michigan fans and people just in general within the Michigan program, on the outside, fans, anybody, view this Ohio State offseason? Because obviously a lot of headlines, but also Michigan won a real national championship, and the coined term offseason national champion doesn't really mean anything. So I'm kind of curious how Michigan views what Ohio State has done this offseason. And then how do you feel about Ohio State versus Michigan in the middle of May?
Yeah, I'll be straight up about it. I mean, I think there is a tinge of jealousy with the Ohio State offseason. Ohio State had the type of offseason that you would expect a 3-time defending Big Ten champion and a defending national champion to have. And, I think especially when it comes to NIL, when it comes to player retention, it's just not where it needs to be yet at Michigan. So when you see all these guys run it back and you see the money that's spent on the coaching staff, I'll be frank, I think there is a little bit of, maybe jealousy is not the word, but there is, there's the envy of it. Now, again, the two sides of this rivalry have been flipped before too, where I seem to recall Michigan winning a few quote unquote off-season championships, and then Ohio State goes on to win it, having the better season. It's going to be interesting to see. I think that the Ohio State offseason, I think what fans really want to see, and it's less about what Ohio State has done and more about the philosophy, the circumstance. Ohio State is tired of losing to Michigan. So they circle the wagons, they round up the donors, and they kind of go all in. And I think that even though Michigan has been, the boogeyman, so to speak, the last few years, I don't know if that same urgency to continue, like they're going to want to, like they want to beat Ohio State. We've been in the building all spring. You walk in and on the video board, it says, what are you doing to beat Ohio State today? But I think that people would really like to see a little more urgency from the Michigan side of things, of continuing to build and to step forward into this new era of college football. So at the same time, I think that when you put these two rosters together, I think that Michigan fans still feel like they have a pretty good shot to, at the very least, compete. I know that point spread right now, I think, was around 10.5 points the last time I looked. Again, it does seem high. I mean, regardless of how you feel about either team. So again, I think when it comes to that game the last weekend in November, which again, this new Big Ten, it could be the first of 2 games they play this year in a 12-team playoff. Who knows? It could be the first of 3 games they play. I mean, it just depends on how these matchups play out. But I think that this Michigan defense is going to give itself a chance to I think they could still probably give them a chance to win just about any game they play. It's the offensive question marks. And, when you put the two rosters together, I don't think it's crazy. Like, it's not crazy to say that Ohio State has probably a little more firepower. And certainly I think, whether you're a Michigan fan that's concerned about Will Howard or not, I think you'd probably take Ohio State's QB situation over Michigan. So certainly I think the thought is that Michigan can go in there and compete, and heck, you control the line of scrimmage. You can probably still give yourself a chance to win that game. But, Ohio State's being talked about as a top 2 or 3 team in the country for a reason. And Michigan's probably just a step or 2 below that right now. So we'll see what happens. So much change, but a lot of it still feels the same. So I don't know if the recipe, we're going to see what the special sauce was when it comes to what Michigan is and what Michigan has been over these last few years. But any Ohio State fan that says Michigan's going 8-4 or 7-5, even with as tough a schedule as Michigan plays, I just don't see that. I still think that last game of the year is going to have maybe not like last year's stakes were all time. I don't know if they ever get higher than that, but I think it's still going to be incredibly consequential in not only the Big Ten race, but also the college football playoff race as well.
Yeah, I think with Texas on the schedule, USC, I believe they play Washington and Oregon. No Penn State, but then you've got Ohio State. I still think this is, even if they lose to Ohio State, 10-2 Michigan team. If they beat Ohio State, possibly 11-1, because that defense, like you said, will keep the Wolverines in every game. Michigan, just like Ohio State, a lot of work left to do before it gets to August 31st. Ohio State is hard at work trying to get back on top of the rivalry. Michigan hard at work trying to stay on top of the rivalry. The guy who stays on top of everything Michigan is Anthony Broom over at thewolverine.com. Anthony, man, really appreciate it. Good conversation, keeping Ohio State fans informed on what the rivalry is going, what's going on in the rivalry, what the rivals are doing up north. Let's do this again, man. Maybe before training camp, we can get another preview into what's going on up in Ann Arbor and keep this thing going as the rivalry never sleeps.
Absolutely, would love to.
Thanks for joining us, Anthony. Thanks for watching, Ohio State fans. We'll see you guys back here at Lettermen Row tomorrow for another opponent preview here as we roll through this summer series.